The honourable member for Flamborough-Glanbrook.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It's always an honour to rise in this chamber, and for this debate, it's a very big honour for me. I'll just take a minute because members have alluded to their experience with citizenship ceremonies, and they are, of course, overwhelmingly emotional. They are, of course, overwhelmingly filled with gratitude by those who are getting their citizenship, but as well as those who were born on these shores, when we realize the great lottery that we won by being born here, the best country in the world. I had a number of memories. I just want to mention two of them. Citizenship ceremony in which my father-in-law, after many, many years being a German citizen, received Canadian citizenship, and then subsequently my own wife, who received Canadian citizenship, and those were big days. But I also want to recognize a phenomenal citizenship judge too, who happened to have been a mayor of Hamilton for 8 years, and then was a citizenship judge for 6 years. And I want to recognize the late Robert Morrow, because he was one of the citizenship judges that I knew that could encapsulate the history of Canada, going from our First Nations, Indigenous, and Métis peoples all the way through to modern day, and capture the entire room for 20 minutes while bringing that whole history to life. What a beautiful history it is. And so to the late Bob Morrow, we say thank you very much for your contribution to citizenship. I'd also like to allude to the fact, one of my colleagues earlier, the campaign to make sure that Sergeant Tommy Prince will be pictured on a $5 bill. Tommy Prince was the recipient of 11 medals, including battle honors. He served in the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, and if I may quote, he's a founding member of Canada's elite 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, and called the Devil's Brigade during the Second World War. He was one of the soldiers who defended Hill 677 in the Battle of Kapyong during the Korean War. And as I said, Madam Speaker, he won 11 medals. That makes him the most decorated Indigenous war veteran, combat veteran, in the history of Canada. So I'd encourage my colleagues, because we've talked a lot about not only a message principle, but doing the right thing, that they would support that initiative. Madam Speaker, I think one of the things that in the midst of this bill, and if I may read the wording that's going to be part of the change, it says, "I swear or affirm that I'll be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada, her heirs and successors, and that I will faithfully observe the laws of Canada, including in highlights, because this is the addition, including the Constitution, which recognizes and affirms the Aboriginal and treaty rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and fulfill my duty as a Canadian citizen." Madam Speaker, I think one of the ways that we can best illuminate that is to get to know our First Nations brothers and sisters. My best education on our indigenous peoples were all of the Indigenous individuals I've known. I had a dark time in my life. It's public knowledge, so I don't mind mentioning it. When I was institutionalized when I was young, and there was 24 First Nations individuals I knew there from all across the country. They generally were there because they were very poor. In those days, you could be incarcerated as a youth if you were incorrigible. And so many of them came and were incarcerated in what they called training schools in those days, but I've spoken about that before in the House. They're really, prison area institutions for boys 8 to 16 years old. And there were several girls' institutions in that way as well. But I don't want to dwell on that as much as I want to say that I got to know First Nations boys at that time. I'd never met First Nations individual. I grew up in Kingston, Ontario, and a member from Kingston, the Islands, so he may be happy about it, he might not, but I grew up on Alfred Street, at Earl Street, Frontenac Street. My brothers went to KCVI, LCVI, QECVI. I went to Old Victoria School that's now been repurposed for Queen's University. But I never met anyone from a reserve or an Indigenous person who was off reserve. And it wasn't until I was in there and I began my education about what it means to be a First Nations citizen. And then, to my great fortune, I met many more. I was on the board of a charity with an individual named Ross Miracle, who's from Tyendinaga, a Mohawk leader, Ross will be happy because I still remember his Mohawk name, Rowin-Nahawi. Another a Cree leader, Larry Wilson from Manitoba, who I just found out recently is a chaplain now in prisons, helping individuals get back on their feet and get into a better way of life. And I remember meeting Chief David General, too, at a very tough time in Caledonia. And I remember touring First Nations with Chief Anita Hill. All of these relationships were profoundly educational for me and made me understand their history, made me understand, too, the desire to be appreciated as individuals and not to be labeled as groups. As so often when we try to solve problems, that's what we do. And so I'm happy for this addition into the oath as long as we bring it to life. One of my friends, and I hope he's okay with me calling him a friend, his name is Nathan Tidridge. I just found out he recently won the Governor General's Award for History for Teaching. Has been one of the most significant Canadian citizens that I know to build bridges for reconciliation with First Nations. I got to know him most intimately after he raised money for a monument. Part of the riding I represent, Madam Speaker, is in Flamborough-Glanbrook is a town called Waterdown, and it's growing in leaps and bounds. And that means that there's lots of development, and traditional lands of First Nations are being gobbled up in a development. And he wanted to make sure that there was a marker there for the Sawarsan people, and he raised the money for the monument and got permission from the city to lay the monument, and had the Lieutenant Governor from Ontario there and myself and some others to make sure that there was not only a ceremony but a solemn oath in the community that the Sawarsan natural area be remembered. It's a traditional territory for the neutral Haudenosaunee and Mississauga of Credit First Nations peoples. And the more I got to know Nathan Tidridge, the more I admired him. May I just quote something that he wrote in regards to our stewardship of the promises we've made to our Indigenous brothers and sisters. An Indigenous teaching is that for non-Indigenous people, ceremony often bookends the real work of governments, whereas for Indigenous people, it is interwoven into the entire process. In Canada, the Queen and her representatives sit at the apex of our state and are therefore the keepers of our highest protocols of national ceremony. The unique relationships between the Queen's representatives and First Nations provide vehicles for convening community, bringing together diverse stakeholders in a nonpartisan way to focus on particular issues, and fostering communication that are not available to politicians tied to a system dominated by a 4-year election cycle. Invitations from the Governor General, an office bound to Indigenous people through treaty and infused with centuries of history, are more readily accepted than those from a politician or government. This unique power allows members from different communities and perspectives to gather in apolitical space that's required to reflect the values inherent in treaty. The power to convene community in no way interferes with the Convention of Responsible Government. However, it can build on the Crown's traditional rights to be consulted, to encourage, and to warn, first articulated in the 19th century British constitutional expert Walter Bagot. The Crown's unique ability to convene community above the political fray is even more important in these polarized, volatile times. It is my hope, Madam Speaker, that not only will this be part of the new oath, but that the current government and future governments will consider empowering the office of the Governor General, the Queen's representative here, to really deal with the relationship aspect to us and First Nations to bring about real change and real reconciliation. Thank you.